The Ice Mountain Covenant, Buried Gods of the Arctic, Chapter 1. The Last Hunt of the Season. The wind howled across the frozen tundra, carving ghostly shapes into the ice like the breath of forgotten spirits. Ira pulled her furs tighter, but the cold still gnawed at her bones. Even for someone born of the Arctic, this night was different. Colder, heavier, as if the ice itself had begun to exhale. She crouched low against the ridge of a snowdrift, her breath a pale wisp against the endless dark. Her gloved fingers tightened around the ivory bow, its grip worn smooth from years of hunting. Just ahead, a great white stag, a rare and sacred sight, moved through the frost-laced trees, its hooves silent in the untouched snow. The last hunt of the season. One arrow. One clean shot. It was tradition. It was survival. Ira inhaled deeply, steadying herself against the wind. The stag lifted its head, eyes gleaming like twin shards of ice. For a moment, she hesitated. It felt wrong. As if the creature knew something she didn't. The ice shifted beneath her. A sound like a mountain exhaling filled the air, deep, resonant, unnatural. The stag bolted, disappearing into the shadows. Ira remained frozen in place, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She had spent her entire life among the glaciers, knew their language, the cracks and groans that signaled movement, the distant thunder of ice breaking free into the sea. But this sound was different, deeper, alive. She slowly lowered her bow, pressing a gloved hand to the ice. At first there was nothing, but then a pulse, a rhythmic thump, too slow for a heartbeat, too powerful for shifting ice. It reverberated through her palm, up her arm, settling into her chest like a drumbeat older than the mountain itself. Something stirred beneath Frostspire. Ira stumbled back, breath quickening. She had to tell the elders. The thought of returning empty-handed, failing the final hunt of the season, made her stomach churn, but instinct screamed at her that this was bigger than tradition. She turned, moving swiftly across the ice, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The village of Iskalvik lay nestled at the base of the towering glacier, a small cluster of wooden homes with thick, fur-lined roofs, their chimneys releasing pale tendrils of smoke into the frigid air. Warm light flickered through slitted windows, and the rhythmic sound of drumming, the beginning of the winter blessing ceremony, echoed across the valley. Her arrival at the village gates did not go unnoticed. Tormund, the chieftain's son and the man expected to lead Iskalvik into the future, stood near the fire pit at the center of the village square. He was taller than most, his broad shoulders wrapped in thick reindeer furs, his piercing gaze always holding the weight of responsibility. When he saw her, his expression darkened. "You failed the hunt," he said, his voice low but carrying the disappointment of the entire village. "There's something more important," Ira shot back, breathless. "The ice. Frostspire. It's moving. No, not moving. Breathing." Tormund frowned, but before he could respond, a heavy presence loomed behind them. Elder Siv had arrived. The village's ice shaman was ancient, her silver-white hair braided with small charms made from carved whalebone. She walked with the help of a staff fashioned from a single piece of glacial ice, rumored to be older than the village itself. "The ice breathes." Siv's voice was like cracking permafrost, sharp, cold, heavy with unseen knowledge. "Tell me, child, did you hear the wind's trickery, or something real?" Ira met the old woman's gaze. "Real," she whispered. "I felt it." Silence fell over the square. The drums continued in the background, their slow, rhythmic pounding eerily similar to the pulse Ira had felt beneath her hand. Siv exhaled, a cloud of frost escaping her lips. "Then the time has come." Tormund turned to her, brow furrowing. "Time for what?" "The Ice Covenant is breaking." The words sent a chill through Ira that had nothing to do with the cold. She had grown up on stories of the Covenant, an ancient pact between the people of Iskalvik and the spirits of Frostspire. No one knew how old it truly was, only that the mountain had protected them for centuries, offering its frozen bounty in return for unwavering reverence. If the Covenant was breaking, it meant only one thing. Something was awakening beneath the ice. Ira clenched her fists. "What do we do?" Siv's gaze drifted toward the towering shadow of Frostspire. "We must go to the heart of the mountain, to the place where the first covenant was made." Tormund tensed. "You mean the ice caverns?" "No," Siv whispered. "Deeper." A hush fell over the village. No one had gone deeper than the known caves, not in generations. The last recorded attempt had ended in disaster. A hunting party had entered the glacier to seek out a warm spring rumored to lie beneath. None returned. The only thing that had emerged was their voices, echoing through the ice for weeks after they had vanished. Ira swallowed hard. "When do we leave?" Siv turned to her fully now, eyes gleaming like frost-covered steel. "Tonight, before the mountain decides to speak again." Chapter 2. Tormund's Dilemma. The fire crackled in the great hall of Iskalvik, casting flickering shadows against the carved wooden beams. The scent of burning spruce filled the space, mingling with the rich aroma of reindeer stew. Tormund sat near the central hearth, staring into the flames, his thoughts as restless as the storm whispering beyond the thick walls. Tonight was the winter blessing ceremony, the night when the chieftain stood before the village, reaffirming their pact with the mountain. As his father, Chieftain Stor, prepared to speak, Tormund knew that next year, perhaps sooner than that, it would be his turn to lead. And he wasn't sure he was ready. The weight of Iskalvik's history pressed against him. He had spent his entire life being groomed to take his father's place, but no lesson, no speech, no hunt had prepared him for uncertainty. Because now the ice was shifting. Because now Era had returned with a warning that he could not ignore. "Drink." A cup was thrust into his hands, and he looked up to see Sigvard, his closest friend and the village's best tracker. His long blonde hair was still damp from the snow, his face ruddy from the cold. "You're brooding again," Sigvard said, settling onto the bench beside him. Tormund exhaled sharply. "Era says the mountain is moving." Sigvard took a deep gulp of his drink before replying. "It's ice. Ice shifts." Tormund shook his head. "Not like this." She felt something beneath Frostspire, something alive. A shadow flickered in Sigvard's eyes, but he forced a smirk. "And you believe her?" Tormund hesitated. Did he? Era had always been reckless, but she wasn't a liar. If she said she felt something breathing in the ice, it wasn't a trick. And Elder Siv had believed her. That alone sent a chill through his spine. "Do you ever wonder if the stories are real?" he murmured. Sigvard frowned. "Which ones?" "The Covenant. The spirits beneath the mountain, the warnings about going too deep." Sigvard set his cup down. "Every child in Iskalvik grows up hearing the same tales. The first people came here, the ice was closing in, and the mountain made them a deal. Respect its balance, and it would let them survive. But if they broke the agreement..." His voice trailed off, but Tormund knew the ending. If they broke the agreement, the ice would awaken. Tormund ran a hand through his thick brown hair, feeling the weight of tradition pressing harder on his shoulders. The winter blessing ceremony was supposed to be a celebration of survival, an affirmation that the balance still held. But tonight, that balance felt fragile. The hall doors swung open suddenly, a gust of frigid air sending embers dancing in the fire pit. The villagers turned as Chieftain Stor entered, his heavy wolf fur cloak dragging against the floor. He was a man carved from the Arctic itself, tall, broad, with a beard touched silver by time. His presence commanded respect, but there was weariness in his step. Tormund stood as his father approached. "Father, come," Stor said, motioning him toward the raised platform at the front of the hall. "It's time. The ceremony." The words he had spoken alongside his father countless times. But tonight, they would ring hollow. Tormund followed, feeling every gaze in the room settle upon him. The people of Iskalvik were waiting, for reassurance, for certainty, for a chieftain who would tell them everything was as it should be. His father raised his hands and the hall fell silent. "We gather on this night as our ancestors did before us," Stor said, his voice deep and steady. "We honor the covenant of ice, the bond between our people and the mountain. We give thanks for its shelter, its bounty, and its wisdom." The villagers responded in unison. "We honor the covenant." Tormund's chest tightened. What if the covenant was already broken? His father continued. "The mountain has watched over us for generations. As long as we remain true, the ice will hold." Tormund's pulse quickened. But what if it doesn't? As his father's speech continued, Tormund's thoughts spiraled. If Frostspire was shifting, if something was awakening beneath, then standing here and repeating old words wouldn't be enough. They had to act. He glanced toward the back of the hall where Era and Elder Civ stood in the shadows. They were waiting for him, for his decision. The words of the ritual left his lips automatically, but his mind was already made up. When the ceremony ended, when the village settled into feasting and song, Tormund would not stay. He was going with Era. He was going into the ice. Chapter 3. The Ice Shaman's Warning. The night air was sharp with the bite of approaching winter, the wind whispering secrets through the wooden beams of Iskalvik. Most of the village had settled into the rhythm of the winter blessing feast, but Tormund and Era had no appetite for celebration. They stood at the edge of the great hall's firelight, their breaths curling in the cold, watching the dark silhouette of Frostspire loom over the village like a frozen titan. It had always been there, always a silent guardian, but tonight something felt different. A crack, deep and distant, echoed through the valley. Tormund tensed. Era didn't even flinch. "The mountain is restless," she murmured. He exhaled, rubbing his hands together against the cold. "Elder Civ said she'd meet us after the ceremony." "She's already waiting," Era said. Tormund turned. There, standing in the darkness beyond the fire's glow, was Elder Civ. The old shaman had always seemed ageless, her skin weathered like ancient parchment, her piercing ice-blue eyes carrying the weight of knowledge beyond years. She wore her ceremonial cloak, woven from reindeer hide and stitched with charms carved from glacial ice, their symbols older than the village itself. She was leaning on her staff, the one said to be cut from the heart of Frostspire's oldest glacier. The ice within it never melted, even by fire. "The two of you should not linger here." Civ's voice was low, edged with something between warning and sadness. "You should leave this place before it is too late." Tormund's stomach twisted. Too late for what? Civ's eyes flicked toward Frostspire. "For the Covenant to hold." Era crossed her arms. "You believe me then? About the ice breathing?" Civ tilted her head slightly, studying her. "I believe you felt something. I also believe you are only seeing the first of what is to come." She took a slow breath, as if weighing her words. Then she spoke again. "I have seen the mountain's heart, and it is thawing." A gust of wind howled through the trees, as if Frostspire itself had heard her words. Tormund felt his chest tighten. "What does that mean?" Civ turned her gaze to him, unreadable. "It means something forgotten is waking, and if it wakes fully, it will not recognize us as friends." Era stepped forward. "The Tulakar? The ancient guardian, the one frozen beneath the ice. The one their ancestors had spoken of in stories. Creature of both protection and destruction." Civ's fingers tightened around her staff. Perhaps something else." Tormund swallowed hard. "What did you see?" Civ hesitated. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "The dream of the shaman. I stood at the edge of the world, where the ice meets the sky. The wind howled, and the northern lights flickered like dying embers. The mountain stood before me, but it was no longer still. It was breathing, shifting, cracking like something inside it was struggling to break free. Then I saw the blue fire, a glow deep within the glacier pulsing like a heartbeat. It spread, melting the ice, revealing something buried beneath. A figure stood in the storm, its form made of frost and shadow, its eyes burning like cold stars. The Tulakar? No, something older, something that should never have woken. It turned toward me and I felt it see me, and then the ice shattered. Civ's voice faded into the night. Era's breath came sharp, fast. "You saw it?" Civ nodded, her knuckles whitening around her staff, and I felt its hunger. Tormund clenched his jaw. He wanted to dismiss it, to say it was just a dream. But the unease in his gut told him otherwise. "The mountain wants us to know," Civ continued. "It is warning us in the only way it can." Era's voice was steady. "Then we need to go inside, deeper than anyone ever has." Tormund turned to her sharply. "That's insane. No one goes that deep. No one has needed to." Civ's gaze flickered between them. "If you go," she said softly, "you may not come back." Silence. Then Tormund exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "If we don't go, we may not have a village left to come back to." Era glanced at him, surprised. Civ studied them both. Then, slowly, she lifted her staff of unmelting ice and held it toward Era. "You will need this." Era hesitated before reaching out. The moment her fingers touched the staff, a shock of cold shot up her arm, almost like the ice was alive. Stiv nodded. The mountain listens. Perhaps it will guide you. Tormund took a deep breath. We leave at first light. Stiv sighed, stepping back into the shadows. Then may the mountain show mercy. The wind howled once more. Far beyond the village, deep within Frostspire, something shifted.